Welcome to the summary video for the Introduction to Cells and Microorganisms lesson. So this lesson is roughly broken down into 3 parts. The first part is kind of describing cells and what the cell theory is and how they were described and how they were discovered. Excuse me. The second part is discussing taxonomy and phylogeny, how that works and really what the point of it is. And the third part is helping to differentiate some of the basics between some of the organisms that we will be talking about this semester. So this video is just to give you kind of a synopsis and an outline and overview of this lesson to help you keep it all pieced together. Since the other videos are divided up into multiple pieces, just to help you all kind of get it all into a cohesive package. So, a word that we will use probably more than any other word this entire class, this entire semester, is the word cell. So, it's very important that you get the concept of what cells are. A cell is the smallest thing that has the ability to be alive. You'll hear it described as the fundamental unit of life. But basically, it means it has all of the structures and all of the abilities to do all of the characteristics, the activities that are required to be defined as alive. So all you need is one cell to be a living thing. And bacteria are actually only made of one cell. And some protists are also one cell, called unicellular. Something like us, humans, we're made of approximately 50 trillion cells, all stuck together, talking, communicating, each one specializing, doing different things, which allows us to be really complex and sophisticated and to do really neat things. But basically, all you need is one. So a cell is the smallest thing, the smallest unit, the smallest structure that has the characteristics of being alive. When you look at cells, one of the cool things to me about biology is when you look at cells, you would think that, if you looked at the cell of a plant versus a human versus a bacteria versus whatever, the mold growing on the rock at the lake, you would think that there would be this huge variety of different cells, but there really aren't. When you really look at them closely, fundamentally, there are only 2 types of cells. Cells are either of the prokaryotic type or they are the eukaryotic type. The prokaryotic organisms are bacteria. The eukaryotic organisms are everything else, with one exception. There are a small group of organisms, small compared to all of the other groups, but there's a small group of organisms that are kind of a combination of prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. They're called the archaea. And they're really, really neat organisms to study, but they don't have any real impact clinically at this point. So because our class is focused on human health and disease, we're not going to really spend any other time talking about the archaea, or spend very little time talking about the archaea, but you'll hear about those in the video today too. So for our class, we'll be talking about bacteria a lot. We'll spend an entire lesson and a couple of lessons down the line talking about prokaryotic cells, what they look like, how we grow them, all of that stuff. We'll spend the same amount of effort talking about eukaryotic cell structures and what they look like, but we're going to spend a lot less time talking about how to grow eukaryotic cells. The lab is really bacteria-based. It's really prokaryotic-based. Okay. There is another group of organisms that we're going to be talking about this semester that have no cells. Oops. They are acellular, without cells. So are they alive? No, because to be alive, you have to be made of cells. But they're still very important in the clinical microbiology world, and those are viruses and a smaller group of diseases caused by something called prions. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about viruses in just a couple of lectures, and then talk about prions at the very, very end of the class. Okay, so you've got prokaryotic cells, you've got eukaryotic cells. All living things are either one type or the other, and you'll learn much more detail as the class progresses about those two different types. Okay? Okay, so moving on to the second part of this lesson, that would be taxonomy. Taxonomy is how we group, how we characterize, how we cluster organisms. There's so many different organisms that are alive that you don't want to have to say, okay, all of the, organisms that eat this food and then list them all. It's just there's so many different organisms. So what we do is we group organisms based on shared characteristics, based on similarities, so that we can say all of the organisms in this group do this. And it just saves time and effort. It's a lot more accurate to do it that way. So you may have probably, hopefully, have already bumped into the concept of taxonomy, where you get, domain, kingdom, did King Philip come over for good spaghetti? Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And you'll learn more about this in the videos. But basically, each level is more specific. So domain could be like any organisms living in the solar system, in the Milky Way. Kingdom would be any organisms living on Earth. Phylum could be any humans living on Earth. Class could be any humans living in the northern hemisphere. Order could be any humans living in North America. Family could be any humans living in Texas. Genus could be any humans living in Central Texas. And species could be any humans living in Austin, right? So if you live in Austin, you also live in you also match all of the other layers, but it's more specific. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller as you come down in the taxonomy layer. So instead of saying all of the humans that live in Texas and having to list them all, we can just say all of the group members of this species do this, okay? So when you are in a microclass, you're going to get a bump into a lot of weird Latin names of organisms, and those names have two parts. It's the genus name and the species name. Kind of think of it as first name and last name. So you may have heard of like Staph aureus. Well, staph is actually a nickname. The real full name of the bacteria Staph aureus is Staphylococcus aureus. The genus is Staphylococcus. The species is aureus. Because this is Latin, you're either supposed to italicize it or underline it. The genus is always capital. The species is always lowercase. So that's why you see these weird names as we're talking about and learning all this stuff. It's basically think first name and last name. It helps you to distinguish one versus another. It's like saying, John. Well, John who? Well, John Smith. Oh, okay. It allows you to be more precise so you know which organisms you're talking about. So you'll learn more about taxonomy and how it, occurs and how it's broken up in the second part, the second videos. And then the final part of this lesson is to give you a little more detail in the organisms that we're going to be talking about. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this part right now talking about the bacteria, because we're going to spend a lot of time on that throughout the semester. This part is really introducing mostly the eukaryotic organisms to you. Okay, so the eukaryotic kingdoms are plants, animals, fungi, and protists. Okay. Plants. We're not going to spend much time in this class talking about plants because there aren't really any human diseases where plants are growing multiplying inside of a person. Yes, you could eat a poisonous plant, but it's the chemical that the plant made that you're responding to. It's not really the organism that's actually infecting you. So plants aren't really considered human pathogens. Animals. Well, because this is a microbiology class, most animals are not small, so we don't get to talk about them. But there is a group of animals that are small and that are clinically important. They are parasitic worms. And the nickname for this group is called the helminths. Okay. And we'll talk about them in more detail. And then we'll do some fungi and protists also in this course. So let's actually dive into the fungi first. Fungi get a bad rap. Most people have heard of fungi. You've probably heard of the term mold, like the stuff growing on your bread, or yeast, like the stuff they use to make beer, right? Those are actually shapes of fungi. So you can have a fungus that's growing as a mold, or it's growing as a yeast. Most people think that associate fungi with plants, probably because many fungi live in soil. So, you know, it rains and that mushroom pops up out of your grass and you go, oh, it's a plant. But it's actually not. It's a fungus. And fungi at a cell level really look more like humans than they do like plants. So there's some misunderstanding about that. Fungi are not photosynthetic. They have to eat their food. They cannot produce their food. They are not plants. Okay, so for the fungi, I want you to focus on kind of three aspects. I want you to focus on the shapes of them, the general morphologies of the organisms. I want you to focus on any specific life cycle things we talk about. And I want you to focus on the way that the group is classified. And so I want to do that right now for the fungi and the animals that we'll talk about and the protists. So you have that kind of right there in front of you. So the two major shapes we've already said of fungi are mold and yeast. So what's the difference? Yeast are unicellular. One cell is the whole thing. Mold are multicellular. There are lots and lots and lots of cells that are all connected together, communicating to each other, making one large organism. Okay? So the individual cell of a yeast is called a yeast cell. The individual cell of a mold, just one of these rectangles, is called a hyphae. For a yeast cell, when it multiplies, it almost looks like it gets pregnant. It gets a little bump, and that bump gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually it gets so big that they split into two separate organisms. And this is called budding. That is not what mold do. Mold, one single cell starts it, and then we'll start multiplying, and all of these cells stay connected until it creates a giant 3D structure. That's why when you look at your bread, it almost looks like cottony. And what those are, those little branches that are sticking out three-dimensionally in space from the surface of the bread. So the individual cells are called hyphae, but the big branches themselves are called mycelium. And that's what you're seeing when you look down at your bread, the cottony thing. So they don't separate into individual cells. They stay all connected into giant organisms. There are some fungi that are really talented, and they have the ability to have more than one shape. Most of the time, a fungus grows as a yeast, or it grows as a mold, or there are a few other less common shapes of fungi. But most of the time it's committed. That's what it is. But there are a few, especially some that are really important clinically, that have the ability to switch back and forth. And they're referred to as dimorphic. Di means two. Morph means shape. So they can do two shapes. And the most common dimorphic switch is between yeast and mold. This is triggered usually by some environmental factor, like temperature change or oxygen levels. Something tells the organism, okay, change. So you're a mold now, switch to a yeast, or your yeast switch back to a mold, or whatever shapes they're switching between. What would be the advantage of being a yeast inside of your body? Well, if you're a single cell, then it's easy for you to move around. You can get in the blood, you can swim around to the brain, do whatever you're going to do. If you're a giant mold, this big chunk of mold doesn't move around quite as easily in your body. But at the same time, if you're a mold, you can penetrate through tissue much easier. So think of like that fungus gets inhaled into your lungs. Well, your lungs have lots of space and thin tissues. So those mold branches can actually push and penetrate through that space and grab on. So there are different times that it makes sense to be a mold. It makes sense to be a yeast, depending on what it is that you want to do within the body. So for the classification part and for the life cycle part of the fungi, we're going to focus on one particular thing, and that is what this little guy is right here. So what started the mold was usually a spore. So a spore is very plant-like in that it's the kind of a seed-like concept where you have something that's not actively growing. It's referred to as dormant, but it can actively grow if it gets in the right condition. And that's what happens when the mushroom pops up. There was a spore sitting in the dirt waiting for the right conditions, and the rain brought the right condition, and boom, it woke up, it started producing new hyphae and growing into this big three-dimensional shape. So most fungi go from spores to molds. Spores are the major way that they spread and reproduce in the world. And the way that they produce their spore is actually also the major way that they are classified. At least the organisms that cause human disease, that group of fungi, are mostly classified based on the way that they produce their spores. Okay, so now let's move over to our next kingdom to talk about, the protists. So the kingdom Protista, which by the way is getting renamed very possibly to Chromoalveolata. I know it's a mouthful, but all of the textbooks and stuff haven't shifted over. But if you bump into that when you're watching a video or whatever, just know that that is a new, potentially alternate name for the kingdom Protista. So the kingdom Protista are interesting. They're eukaryotes, but they're not plants, they're not fungi, they're not animals. They're just kind of the other eukaryotes. So when you look at the kingdom Protista, there's all kinds of different life cycles and shapes and things that they do. So much so that they're actually broken down into two subkingdoms. The subkingdom Algae, which are very plant-like, and they're photosynthetic. They're not actually plants, though, because they don't have the same structures as the plant cells. They don't have the same details as the plants, but they are photosynthetic. And then you have the subkingdom Protozoan. And the protozoa are where we find most of the organisms that cause human disease. Algae are not truly considered human pathogens. So the protozoans, very, very diverse group. A lot of them love fresh water. You go out in Lake Travis, get sick. Protozoans love that. There are also many protozoans that are spread through insects. So we'll talk about them from both of those point of views throughout the semester. So protozoa, it's a really, really diverse group. There's not a lot of kind of common things to talk about. But for most of the protozoans, there are at least two phases in their life cycle. There is a dormant phase, kind of seed-like, kind of spore-like, and there is a non-dormant phase where they're eating and swimming and multiplying. So the dormant phase is called the cyst phase. The adult phase is generically called the trophozoite phase. I'll warn you, many protozoans have a bunch more phases than just these two, but they have at least a cyst phase and at least a trophozoite phase typically. One really cool thing that protozoans do, most of the time, you know, you think of like a seed. You go from seed to plant and you can't go backwards, but protozoans can. If the environment is dangerous or threatening, they can be a cyst and survive. If the environment changes, they can, you know, wake up and go into this moving and swimming thing, trophozoite shape. And then if the environment changes, they can go back to a cyst. They can go back and forth, which is a really big advantage for protozoans. The way that the protozoans themselves are classified, at least historically, has been by the way that they move. So an important micro word is the word motility. It's like mobility, but with a T. And this means the ability to move. So there are four major types, there are four major ways of movement for protozoans. And that's how they're classified, and you'll hear more about those in the videos. Okay, and the final thing we need to talk about for this video is the very small group of animals that we will be talking about this semester. They're animals very, very, very macroscopic usually. You know, you don't have to have a microscope to see an elephant. And there are actually very few animals that are truly microscopic. But there is a small group of parasitic worms, the nickname for which are the helminths. And the reason they're microscopic is they're eggs. So the ova is the name for the egg, and the egg is usually microscopic, and it's also the thing that is usually spread from person to person. And then it gets into the person and turns into an adult. So this is the microscopic part of most of these worms, and it's also the contagious part of most of these worms. Okay, so this group of helminths, they're classified into 3 separate groups: the cestodes, the trematodes, and the nematodes, based on shape. You may have heard of tapeworms. That falls into this helminth group, so you'll be expected to know the terms cestodes, trematodes, and nematodes, and just a little bit about them the videos will go through. Okay, so that's the classification part: cestode, trematode, nematode. Life cycle would be the ova versus adult. And then the shape, there's not really any, kind of major shapes. So flatworms versus roundworms, the flukes versus tapeworms, cestode, trematode, nematode. Okay, so that kind of is the summary video for this first lesson. Watch the rest of the videos to get details on all of this stuff. Remember, when you finish the videos, you should have a set of notes, just like you would if you sat through an hour-and-a-half lecture. Look at the outlines to help you focus your efforts and your notes. The outline also has links to the textbooks if you would like to see it in writing and kind of see it in that capacity from that type of media. Once you've gone through all of the materials, look through the objectives, make sure you can answer those. Look through and complete the lesson activity, make sure you can answer those. And then the study quizzes that go with each lesson. If you have any questions, you're getting stuck on anything, post to the Muddiest Point discussion board, and I will look at them. Hopefully your peers will look at them, and everybody will try to answer questions as we go. If there's anything that we're really getting stuck on, I'll make a supplementary video and upload it to answer the Muddiest Points. Best of luck as you complete this lesson, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Good luck.